Okay, so one of the things that I found to be the most interesting about the history of China, and there are a lot of things that are interesting, but one of the things that spanned multiple waves was the way that nomads had a great impact on China, the way China's history unfolded, and specifically in the way that the well, not necessarily nomads only, but I would say rather external forces or like foreigners. And of course, you can see this in the Wave 4 when the imperialistic nations of Europe come and start carving China up. But you can also see it earlier in China's history when they take a bit of a less aggressive approach. Like, for example, if you look at Wave 3, when the Mongols conquered the southern Song dynasty and started the Yuan dynasty, I found it really interesting how they sort of like I found it really interesting how the Mongols had a huge impact on the future of China because, like, during the Song Dynasty, China was seeing rapid industrial revolution, developing gunpowder, developing the compass, developing extremely advanced ships for its time. Uh, and then all of a sudden, the Mongols come in and completely stop all of that. And if you look at the way that the West was developing at the same time, Europe was in the medieval ages, the late medieval, and if you like, if the Chinese were developing gunpowder and massive ships at the same time that Europe was going through the medieval ages, you can only imagine what they would have been developing 1,000 years later, or like if they could if they could develop gunpowder back then they could surely develop something even better in the future. And also, like if they had been allowed to continue developing and industrializing, then they could have ended up developing uh, guns. And then if they had developed guns, they could have easily destroyed the Mongols. And they could have easily, if they had developed guns at that time when Europe was still using like swords and horses, then surely by the time that Europe came to invade during the Qing, surely by that time they would have developed something that would have allowed them to protect themselves. At least they would have probably have steam powered ships that could pose a threat to Britain's battleships. And then another way that nomads impacted Chinese history was the when they merged with Chinese culture. This was another thing that I found to be very interesting. The way that China was like it was almost as if China was like a giant melting pot of culture. Like you could have so many different cultures. Like for example, if you look at the Wave 2 when the Shanbei invade China and they start the Wei dynasty, and they become syncretized with Chinese culture. Like they don't simply like expel Chinese culture or and put in their own culture, or the other way around, but rather they become Chinese culture. And you can also see that in when the Zhou, who were like when the Zhou took power over the Shang, the Zhou were like the external, like they were like a fringe group, like they weren't like pure Chinese. And then when they did invade the Shang, and took over the Shang, they sort of their culture. Well, first, the emperor, I forgot what his name was of the Zhou. The Pattern Emperor was one of his nicknames. He, I think it was Wei, or it was either Wei or Wu. I think it was Wei, but uh, he he saw that he thought that the Shang culture was more it was better than he thought the Shang culture was better than the Zhou culture, so he taught his people the Shang culture, and so that sort of made it easier for them when they conquered the Shang to merge their culture with the Shang, and so I found it really interesting how nomads were able to mix their culture with China's culture, and by mixing their culture with China's culture, make China's culture into something better in a way, and define Chinese culture. And you can also see that with not only with Wave 1 when the Zhou took over, but also like I said when the Shanbei took over. Uh, because the Wei Dynasty, like it was like a huge. It wasn't like a little small thing, and it ended up developing like impressively and became impressively civilized. And they even adopted the Confucian bureaucracy, Chinese language, names, manners, dress, and they intermarried with the Chinese. So they basically became Chinese. Like they took over China, but in a sense, Chinese culture took over their culture. It's sort of like it was like dominant to their culture, and it sort of automatically just kind of replaced their culture. Um, yeah. So the other wave so another way to look at it is you can look at the way that foreign powers came into China during the late Qing, and also how they sort of carved up the melon of China, because sure they're not like barbarians in our sense of the word, as in like like using axes and living in as nomads, but they were barbarians to the Chinese. Even Emperor Qianlong often referred to them as barbarians or sea barbarians, and it was very interesting how to see how the the impact you could see in the invasion of China and the carving up of China. You could see the impact of the Mongols' invasion of the Song so many years earlier, because like I said earlier, if the Song had been allowed to develop, it's very much like possible that they could have defeated the British and protected themselves. But you could sort of contrast the way that the imperialistic nations of Europe behaved with China to the way that other nomads behaved with China. Because when nomads around China, like the northern nomads from the steppe and from Manchuria, when they invaded China, they they didn't they like I said, they became part of Chinese culture. But when Europeans invaded China, they thought that Chinese culture was below them, and they didn't. Most of them didn't make any effort to learn it, except for a few like Matteo Ricci, and they just completely ignored it, and they tried to impose their own culture. So, an interesting question to ask is like, what if, what if Europe had like become like absorbed into Chinese culture? Like, well, in a way, if you look at it, Europe kind of did. Its culture kind of did get absorbed into Chinese culture, especially if you look at the nationalist era when the nationalists were in power of China. They were getting completely westernized. Like I remember in the video, they had a video of them of a bunch of Chinese people at a disco. Like if that's not taking in the external influence, then I don't know what is. And even if you look at during Mao's age, when there was huge Soviet influence in China during communist China. Um, so yeah, I didn't actually think of that before, but yeah, it's kind of like they even when the Europeans invaded China, China still managed to sort of absorb some of their culture, and you can even look at it as Christianity. Some Chinese converted to Christianity. And that could be that's an example of a way that they absorbed their culture. And yeah, so in conclusion, I guess the thing that I found the most interesting was the way that nomads or external forces played a huge impact on China's development and China's history, and then also the way that China was sort of like, okay, this is like a biology reference. I don't know, but like it's like China was like a giant white blood cell that was like absorbing like bacteria. Like the white blood cell like goes around, and then when it finds like bacteria, it like envelops the bacteria with its cell membrane. And it's almost as if China is that white blood cell, and it's sort of like absorbing the other the other um uh the other cultures into its membrane. Like yeah. So I found it really interesting how China was able to absorb other cultures, and how nomadic groups played a huge impact on China's development.